introduced. The House therefore comes to questions for oral answer. Question number 1 in the name of Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by all his statements?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why did he tell reporters that Cameron Slater's decision to OIA Phil Goff's SIS briefing in 2011, that decision was, quote, nothing to do with my office?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, because I believe it to be correct.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
In light of the Inspector General's report that found that his office was deeply involved in encouraging Mr. Slater to make that OIA request, does he now accept that his office was involved in assisting Mr. Slater to make that OIA request?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no. In fact, the report does not show that my office was deeply involved. There are a series of claims made and not a single one of them has stacked up. And that's why Phil Goff had to leak the report yesterday, because he knew it wouldn't stand up on its own merits.
Supplementary.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Inspector General of Security and Intelligence then wrong when she wrote, information which his Deputy Chief of Staff received from the NZSIS was used by Jason Eade, a senior advisor within the Prime Minister's office, to assist Mr. Slater in making the OIA request?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, firstly, the full statement actually from the Inspector General makes it quite clear that in so much there were any discussions, they did not breach any obligations of confidentiality owed by the New Zealand SIS on that part of the PMO staff. It's quite contested, Mr. Speaker, about what discussions were held between Mr. Eade and ultimately Mr. Slater. But I make the point, there were a wide range of journalists that asked for exactly the same information. If the thing was germane to Mr. Eade, how come all of the other journalists asked for that information?
Supplementary.
Order. Order. Can I just have a bit of assistance from members to my left with keeping the noise down so that I can hear the content of the answer?
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So to be clear, is the Prime Minister saying the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security got it wrong when she wrote, quote, information which his Deputy Chief of Staff received from the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service was used by Jason Eade, a senior advisor within the Prime Minister's office, to assist Mr. Slater in making the OIA request? Was she wrong?
Mr. Speaker,
right, Honourable Prime
firstly,
Minister.
I would say A, it was contested. B, Mr. Speaker, it's quite clear that what drove the OIA requests from a wide range of people, journalists and Mr. Slater, was A, the public comments made by Mr. Goff and the public comments made by me. If it was solely germane to information from Mr. Eade, how come every other journalist asked for the same information?
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
So is the Prime Minister now saying that he disagrees with the findings of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security that information, and I'm quoting here, information which his Deputy Chief of Staff received from the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service was used by Jason Eade, a senior advisor within the Prime Minister's office, to assist Mr. Slater in making that OIA request? Is he saying he no longer accepts the Inspector General's findings?
Mr. Speaker,
right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm saying I agree with the Inspector General when she said I personally played no involvement other than a phone call on the 22nd of July, despite all the assertions made by the opposition members. Secondly, I agree with the Inspector General when she says that there was no breach of confidentiality owed to the NZSIS, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the Inspector General when she said there was misleading information given to me, and on that basis I've accepted the apology from the SIS.
Point of order.
Order.
Point of order.
Order. Order.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
This is a point of order. I wish to hear it in silence.
Mr. Speaker, I have used now 3 supplementaries trying to get an answer to this question, and the Prime Minister has answered many other questions, of which were interesting, I give you that, but he has not answered whether he accepts this finding of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security.
Order. Can I offer some assistance to the member? If he simply asks a concise question, I can try and assist to get the answer. But if the member looks at the last question, he finished with a part of the question that was concise enough, but if he had led in with quite a lot of extraneous material in the start of his question. So to move this matter forward, I am going to give the member an additional supplementary question. I hope he uses it well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russel Norman.
Does he accept the findings of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security that, and I quote, information which his Deputy Chief of Staff received from the NZSIS was used by Jason Eade, a senior advisor within the Prime Minister's office, to assist Mr Slater in making the OIA request?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly accept there may well have been a discussion between Mr Eade and Cameron Slater on this matter. I also accept that it's quite contested, and I also accept that it was not in breach of any obligations on them. Mr Speaker, every single political party in this parliament has staffers and politicians that talk to the media. Yesterday, Phil Goff was talking to the media about the contents of this report, despite the fact there being an embargo.
Order.
Supplementary.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he now stand by his statement that the OIA request was nothing to do with my office, given that he just said in that answer that he accepted that Jason Eade and Cameron Slater, when Jason Eade was working in his office, discussed this very matter?
Mr. Speaker,
Prime Minister.
Absolutely it was nothing to do with my office, and if you look at paragraph 225 of the report, it says, oh well, you won't like to hear this because I know it bursts your bubble, but here we go. It said, quote unquote, it did not find, the inspector did not find any indication of collusion by or direction to the New Zealand SIS over the request. The simple facts of life are that a wide range of people asked for information. The SIS made the decision how to process it. The SIS made the decision when it was released. It was nothing to do with my office and nothing to do with me. And that's the problem, isn't it? Phil oversold it to everyone, and now he's
order.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question. Order. Order. I've called Dr. Russel Norman for a supplementary question.
Given that in his earlier answers he conceded that Jason Eade and Cameron Slater did discuss this issue, when did he become aware that Jason Eade and Cameron Slater were discussing the issue of the release of the Goff briefing?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the first I would have been aware of it was when there was an allegation made in the book, and then ultimately as a result of this there's been obviously an inspector's report, and what I've been made aware of that there was no breach of any confidentiality or any information, that my office wasn't involved and all the decisions were made by the SIS. I hate to tell the member, but there's a good reason Phil Goff leaked it. It doesn't stack up today.
Order.
Supplementary.
Order. 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 And Prime Minister, when I'm on my feet calling for order, that's no excuse for the Prime Minister to interject. Supplementary question. Right on, the Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister stand aside from his job as Prime Minister while a full Royal Commission can look into the truth around the dirty politics that he has operated out of the office of the Prime Minister?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no, but I will be interested in reading the police report of how Nikki Hager got stolen emails.
Order. 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 Question number 2, Andrew Bailey.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Finance.